This is the Citizen of Heaven podcast number 114, Tolkien, Part 2. I'm Hal Hammonds, and I am a Citizen of Heaven, and your embedded correspondent in Satan's world. Thanks for checking in again this week. Thank you for coming back for Part 2 of my conversation with Josh Everett and Edwin Crozier. We discussed the existence of evil in the first segment. Please check that out if you have not done so already. In this segment, we discuss Joseph Loconte's excellent book, A Hobbit, a Wardrobe, and a Great War. He discusses the role World War I had on the lives of Tolkien and his friend C.S. Lewis. Here we are particularly dealing with how adversity can build faith in us, if we have enough faith to begin with. This is what I've been reading. In A Hobbit, a Wardrobe, and a Great War, Joseph Loconte uses the setting of what we call World War I to tell the story of J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. Both men saw the worst humankind has to offer, up close and personal. One chose to lean on faith. One, at least at first, rejected it rudely and completely. After all, how could a righteous, loving God permit such atrocities? It's the same struggle we have faced since the fall. How can we fight off despair and find stronger faith in times of crisis? And how can we encourage our neighbors to do the same?
Interestingly, Lewis's ultimate response, he did initially give up. How could, he can't be a righteous God if he's allowing these terrible, awful things. I think it's important to point out that what made that only initial, and that's what you alluded to in your question there, what made that only initial is at some point he began to realize, well, wait a minute, if there is no God, how can I accuse the supposed God of wrong? If there's no God, there's no such thing as wrong. I can't accuse him of unrighteousness because I can't have a standard of righteousness and unrighteousness. If I'm going to say there's a standard of righteousness and unrighteousness with which to accuse this God, then, oh, wait a minute, there must be a God. There must be God out there, because I can't accuse God of unrighteousness unless there is a standard of righteousness and unrighteousness, and there can only be a standard if there is a standard giver. Okay, now I got to start wrestling with why would the standard giver act like this? And those are some deep questions, and I'd love to get into all that as well. But I think at heart, there is ultimately the recognition that if there is a standard giver, someone that says there is right and wrong, there's an understanding that there is also a judge, that eventually the standard giver is going to make things right. And that's the thing through the Psalms. For anyone who is despairing and discouraged, I really, really, really recommend studying the Psalms, and not just at a surface level, not just reading through one a day for the next 5 months, though I think that's awesome too. I mean, dig in, dig deep. I was recently up in Minneapolis and got to spend some time with good brother Rick Lanning, who preaches the gospel up there. And he was just telling me about he and his wife had recently, their Bible reading and study had been in the Psalms. And he said, I don't know why I'd missed this. I may be ad-libbing a little bit. I don't remember his exact words, but it was basically one of the things we really grasped this time through is there is a lot of lamenting in the Psalms. Yeah, we because of the way we often study the Psalms, so we get into Bible classes and there's 150 of them, and we say, well, we can never cover 150 of them in 13 weeks. So let's pick out this one, and let's pick out that one, and let's pick out this one, and let's cover all the genres. We can have this idea that the Psalms is just, Psalm 23 over and over and over again, when in reality, it's more like Psalm 22 over and over and over again, with Psalm 23 sprinkled in. There's a lot of lament. There's a lot of time that even David was in despair and discouraged, but what anchored him is that he knew there is a judge, and he knew that the judge was going to do what was right. Honestly, the biggest fear for David that I think I see in the Psalms is there was an underlying understanding that ultimately, if it was merely about justice and what was right, he should get dragged off with the wicked in judgment. And so it was really powerful for him to remember the name of the Lord that God revealed to Moses, which is the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty. Anchoring in that name of God and believing that God exists is what kept David and any of the other psalmists, whatever we believe about who's actually writing these psalms, what kept them anchored was, I believe this God exists and he will do what is right. Not on my timetable, but he will do what is right.
Mm-hmm.
I think, it's important to think about, Joseph Loconte talks a lot about World War I, as you mentioned, and thinking about the environment that Tolkien and Lewis experienced in a very intimate way. We know that Tolkien, said that he lost all of his closest friends save one by the end of the war. The members of he had this sort of club of writers and academics that and when he was in college and all of them say one. I think Lewis said the same thing in the book, that almost all of his closest friends had died by the end of the war. I mean, World War I was a very significant war. And when you go back to, the 1800s and you think about the casualty count, in the American Civil War, which is the war in which the most Americans have ever died, we look at about 620,000 casualties. Well, World War I, depending on what source you look at, most argue it's around 17 to 20 million soldiers died in wartime deaths. That's about 32 times the deaths of the Civil War. If you fought the Civil War 32 times, that's what you'd have to do to get to the level of World War I. If you go back to the American Revolution, only about 6,800 died. 6,800 people. When you think about, they had that musket ball, right? The musket rifle that couldn't fire very many shots very quickly. It was, and so you had very, very low casualties. And then the mini ball bullet that with the Civil War, increased that dramatically. They had the rifling in the barrels that made them more accurate. But then in World War I, you got machine guns and tanks and airplanes and flamethrowers and chemical weapons and all that. So there was a lot of death. Tolkien and Lewis, experienced it directly. I think Tolkien was involved in the Battle of the River Somme. And there were actually eyewitness accounts there that soldiers reported that literally the water of the River Somme turned like a solid sheet of red. There was so much blood being poured into that river. It was like a solid sheet of blood, right? And so it was a horrific thing, right? So as you mentioned, people began around this time. This is the beginning of what we call modernism, right? And there's a lot of, writers and artists and philosophers and scientists and people in society that are beginning to just significantly question the existence of God. He had already been called into significant question in the 1800s with Charles Darwin in 1859 with The Origin of the Species, the theory of evolution. And of course, a lot of that ideology of survival of the fittest is what Hitler and his racial hierarchy sort of theory, right? The idea of the Aryan race, like a lot of these things that are happening with eugenics, the idea of there's certain hierarchies of human beings, and it's okay to weed out certain people because that's just science, right? That's just science. And so science is starting, to at least according to some people, to call into question the existence of God and the authority of the Bible. I don't think that science calls that into question. I think it's man's misunderstanding of science that really leads to that. And so you have these people, piggybacking on top of Darwin and this idea of evolution, and maybe that's the explanation for the origin of our existence. And then you've got 20 million people that have died in this war, and so people were putting those together and saying, okay, well, how can an all-loving, all-powerful God, if he does exist, and how could he allow such horrible loss of life, right? And according to a sort of a man-made value system, maybe that makes sense. And you have a lot of authors like T.S. Eliot, who wrote a work called The Wasteland, who is heavily questioning the existence of God. And he talks a lot about the war, World War I, and all of the death and the horrible things. You've got people like Ernest Hemingway, who lost his faith and wrote A Farewell to Arms, and he has this horrible ending where Lieutenant Henry's his significant others, her name's Catherine, and she dies in childbirth at the end, and he's questioning if there's no God, then how can there be consequences for decisions? Why are we still suffering consequences from decisions? He's trying to, it's sort of this modernist sort of idea. But I think, as Christians, we just have to understand that God does not promise us that that physical death isn't going to happen, right? In Ecclesiastes 12, verse 7, he says, and the dust returns to the earth as it was, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. That is the natural way of this world, right? Everything that lives is supposed to die. In Hebrews chapter 9, and just as it is appointed for man to die once, and after that comes judgment. So we are appointed the task of, we owe God our lives, our physical lives. We must give that over, and we must die physically, unless Jesus comes again while we're still on the earth, and or unless you're Elijah or Elisha and you're taken up into the heavens. Most of us are going to physically die. But we don't want to assume that that is inherently evil, right? I think that's where the world gets off on this, and that's where the modernists like T.S. Eliot and Hemingway and Wilfred Owen and a lot of these atheist sort of writers that we belong to this age we call modernism. That's where they got off, as they were judging sort of God by their own sort of belief system, where death is always bad. Physical death is always bad. How many times have we heard stories about people that lose a loved one in our own time? I lost my dad, or I lost my mom, or I lost a child, or I lost my spouse, and they get mad at God, and they blame God, and they accuse God of evil because this person died. God doesn't promise us that we're not going to die, and we don't need to sort of view death as inherently evil. It's natural, it's inevitable, it's morally neutral. That's what I teach my students. Death is morally neutral, right? God is no respecter of persons. He doesn't promise, well, if you're a good person, you're not going to die. But if you're a bad person, then you will, right? All throughout Scripture, we see that, everybody, no matter what side they were on, is susceptible to death. And it doesn't really mean anything about who you are as a person or God's love. He even allowed his own son to die, right? God allowed his own son, his beloved, only begotten son, to die physically, right? And so if death is evil, then why would he allow that? So like, who are we to demand that God spare us or spare our loved ones, right? Every human being practically that has existed on this earth since the beginning has died, right? Both the righteous and the wicked. And so who are we to demand that, well, you must spare my mother or father or son or spouse, or you must spare me physically, or else you're wrong for that. And we sort of confuse our own beliefs and opinions about that as if they're authoritative, and we don't see the big picture. So I think that's an important thing. That was, Tolkien and Lewis, at least Lewis later in life, when he came to back to his faith, I think they understood that. Lewis wrote a book called The Problem with Pain, or The Problem of Pain, and he argues that part of our problem, we want to act like pain or death is always bad, and it's not always bad. And we can talk more about that as we go.
Yeah. Well, it's at some point it starts sounding like we're arguing with 8-year-olds, right? It's I stubbed my toe and therefore I have a bad father. How does the one thing connect to the other? Dad, they shouldn't have treated me like that. Well, okay, that's true. What are you going to do about it? Well, frankly, probably nothing is what I'm going to do about that. Well, life is like that. I'm not satisfied with that. Well, I'm not asking you to be satisfied with that, but hopefully if you survive long enough, you will come to realize this is the way of the world. This is the world that we're living in, and we make the best of it wherever we happen to be. And some kids make it and some kids don't. Some kids remain 8-year-olds for the rest of their life. And I listen to people making the pain argument, especially with regard to parents. I understand that you think the world is broken when your child dies. I get that. That makes sense. Children should not die before their parents. I understand that. But when somebody loses their faith because they lose a parent, didn't you think that was going to happen? That's the way the world works. Like Josh is saying here, pain, death, these things are not bad things. They're life things. They're earthly things. And I love how Tolkien has his faith intensified because of these things. And ultimately Lewis is drawn to faith because of the pain, because of the existence of evil. There must be some kind of counterbalancing power on the other side that allows us to go our own way, that allows us to make mistakes and suffer the consequences of our mistakes and seek him out as a result of that, rather than just lashing out at the void saying life's not fair. What a childish way of looking at the world.
Well, okay, so if I can push back a little bit, is that okay if I push back just a little bit, Hal?
Oh, sure, I guess.
Okay, so you're right. On the one hand, we all see that it's wrong when the infant dies. Children aren't supposed to die before their parents. But what did we expect to happen with our parents? Well, I tell you, I didn't expect my parents to die when I was 12 and when my little brother was a month old. That's not right either. That's not supposed to happen. And then when we move beyond just our own personal experience, we look at a world that is full of folks who are starving in places because there are wicked people who are doing wicked things that are messing up their countries and keeping a good majority of the inhabitants in their nations in a poverty-stricken, starving state. So I guess I do want to be careful about just dismissing this argument, which is why I think it's important to go back to what actually ultimately brought Lewis around, and that is, I can't actually make that argument, though, without coming back to God must be out there. Because if God's not out there, I can't complain about all this wickedness. It's just not wicked. If there's no God, there's no wickedness. It's just That's just the way it is. So I think it's important to get back to that. Then we have to start figuring out, well, why would the God who is out there allow this and act like this? And for me, what I get back to is because the alternative is one that I don't want. It's not one that anybody wants. When people actually start thinking through what would it take to keep all of that from happening, well, it would take God running everybody around like little automatons and robots and forcing them to behave. What he has done is he has allowed, and this goes back to where Josh started, he has allowed free will. And when you allow free will, which I want free will. I don't want God running me around like a little robot, making all the decisions for me. I want to make my choices. Well, if I want that for me, am I okay with him not doing that for everybody else? That everybody else here is automatons to make sure that my life is easy. I guess I would like that, but I need to understand all these people around me. They want free will as well. And the alternative is not that, God just fixes everything. It's that God runs everything just absolutely and takes over everybody's will, which none of us want. What he has done is given us that freedom. So Psalm 110 in verse 3, where God reveals to the king, or the psalmist reveals that, look, your people will offer themselves freely. But what that means is there's a whole lot of people that won't. And to him, they're going to offer themselves freely to evil and wickedness, and they're going to be purveyors of evil and wickedness. And what has God done? God, it's kind of like the parable of the weeds in the field. God is allowing that to continue on, and a day is going to come when he makes the division and pulls those apart. But as that is happening, there is a lot of pain in the middle of this, because that's just what sin does. It's not just this is the way life works, because it's not the way it was intended. When God created the world, it was a good world. It was a very good world. And all this pain that we're dealing with wouldn't happen. But sin came into the world, and that is what's caused this. And God's plan has not been, you know what, I am immediately going to bring judgment on anyone who does wrong, or I'm going to jump in and I'm going to force everybody to do exactly what I want. His plan has been, I'm going to let this continue on. I'm interacting. I'm coming in at certain times. I'm staying back at certain times. I'm letting people make their choices. In the end, judgment is going to come, and there will be a division, and God will set it all right. And he will set every bit of that right. And I think that's one of the things that we have to hang on to, is that he hasn't promised to set it all right today, but he has promised to set it all right. And it's just by coincidence, I'm in a gospel meeting this week, and last night I presented a lesson where I actually quoted C.S. Lewis. And for some reason, I can't believe in my notes I didn't actually footnote where this is from, so I can't remember. This may have been from Mere Christianity, but I'm not sure. C.S. Lewis wrote, "Why is God landing in this enemy-occupied world in disguise and starting a sort of secret society to undermine the devil? Why is he not landing in force, invading it? Is it that he is not strong enough? Well, Christians think he is going to land in force. We don't know when, but we can guess why he is delaying. He wants to give us the chance of joining his side freely. I do not suppose you and I would have thought much of a Frenchman who waited till the Allies were marching into Germany and then announced he was on our side." And that's where we are right now. We're in the secret society phase. We're in that phase where God is not making it completely plainly obvious that he's got the victory. He's waiting to see who's going to, in faith, come onto his side, give them his allegiance. He is going to come in and he's going to set it all right. But if we waited until that moment, we wouldn't think much of that person.
No.
That's a very good point. I mean, when we ask God, to spare our loved ones, or to not allow death to happen, or not allow bad things to happen to good people, essentially we're asking him to take away free will.
Yes.
We're asking him to make everybody into robots that can only do good things so that no bad will ever happen. And that's just not the way that God set things up.
And it's not what any of us want. None of us want that.
Sure. Yeah. We don't want to be robots. If we are, what's the value in anything that we do? God, from the very beginning with Adam and Eve, told you there's this tree and there's one thing you need to choose to do, which is don't eat of it. And he could have programmed Adam and Eve to just be good and to never eat that tree,
Or not put the tree there in the first place.
Yeah, not put the tree in the first. Yeah, exactly. Not have the temptation. Mm-hmm. But is there, would we want that with our children? Would we want to create children that are robots that are forced to live a certain way? Like, would that really, as the creator, does that give if the creation is that way, does that give the creator satisfaction when the creation just simply does what it's programmed to do? I don't want to put myself in God's shoes and be able to explain why God has created the system the way he has, but he has, we know. And so we have to allow that when we accuse God of wrongdoing in that regard. And, it's not a fair assessment. And we have to also remember that this life is not all there is, right? That's really the issue, I think, we're talking about, is that we're so wrapped up in this life and this earth and worldly existence. And a lot of that's because of science, people looking at life from a purely scientific viewpoint. I think Tolkien once said that to the modernist, i.e. the atheist, the purely sort of physical oriented thinker, death is an absolute catastrophe, right? Whenever death happens, it is a catastrophe. It is an earth-shattering catastrophe, because to that person, it means the total, complete ceasing of existence, right? For that person, the person that's died, they literally no longer exist. There's no hope that you'll ever see them again. There's no hope that you'll ever be able to communicate with them, because they're gone, right? But to Tolkien, the Christian, he says death is what he called a eucatastrophe, right? Mm-hmm. Eucatastrophe, which is the exact opposite, right? It's a cause of great joy, because hopefully, if this person lived the right way, it means entrance into heaven, into the place where there's no tears and no sorrow, and there's no death anymore. There's no physical death ever again. So we need to get away from this idea that whenever people die, well, they cease to exist and they're gone. I'm never going to see my father or my mother or my sister or whoever again. We don't know for sure what the case is, but that does, it's not this. We know that we have this eternal soul, that even in hell still exists, right? So we don't, God chooses not to cause us to cease to exist, even I think spiritually when we enter into the next realm. There's an author named John Donne that wrote a poem called A Valediction Forbidding Mourning. And it's about death. And he talked about the other day, whenever we die, it's like we melt. He uses the word melt. And I think he's implying that, we simply, it's like a solid going from a melting and going from a solid to a liquid or to a gas, right? That we, this spiritual matter that our soul is made of never ceases to exist. We may change from a physical form to a spiritual form, but we still exist. And so in that poem, he's telling his wife, whenever I die someday, keep things in perspective. Don't fall into despair. Remember that this physical existence is just a certain form. And when we die, we change form, but we still exist, and we're still, there's still hope that we can be reunited in these kinds of things. And I think that that's what Tolkien understood, and Lewis later in life understood too. And he became one of the greatest apologists, right? Christian apologists, and wrote a lot of good books, about this issue. But too often we think of death as like the end of existence, and it's this earth-shattering experience, and we accuse God, of wrongdoing because of it, where he never promises us that, that we're not going to die. He never promises that we won't experience the loss of loved ones. And really, it's all about the way we react to it, right? What's the saying that life is, 10% what happens to you and 90% how you respond to what happens to you, right? You get to choose how you respond to death or to pain or to whatever wrongdoing that you perceive is happening. You get to choose whether you respond positively and allow that to strengthen you. Like as it talks about in James, right? Count it all joy when you fall into various trials. Death is perhaps one of the most significant trials we can ever go through as people. But count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. So when we go through these things, we have this potential to become more perfect, to become stronger in our faith. If when times are going great and wonderful around us, we don't typically grow as much as we do when things are going badly.
Oh, yeah.
So it's all about the way we respond to these things.
So something that folks who are just fans of the movies wouldn't be aware of, and I think actually plays into this, in the books, the Lord of the Rings books, there's the hobbits come back to the Shire, and when they get back to the Shire, they find out that things at the Shire are not the same. This wonderful little idyllic village that they left that seemed to be untouched by all the evils and ravages of the world, despite the fact that they have defeated the enemy, the big enemy that they were chasing, despite the fact that they've defeated, they come back to the Shire, and in all of this time, something has gone very awry. And it's my wife's least favorite parts of the book, not the least of which is because for some crazy reason, Tolkien decided that Saruman in the Shire would be called Sharky. It's the worst character name in the whole series, honestly. But but Saruman he doesn't die as he does in the movies at the Tower of Orthanc. He actually gets let go. And he and Grima team up, and they get to the Shire, and they decide they're going to take over. And it's terrible. And you find out that all of those hobbits, for all of their seeming goodness and all of that, they end up kind of dividing along the lines of the people who are going to follow along with Saruman and the ones who won't. It's just terrible. But what are Frodo and Sam and Merry and Pippin now able to do? They are now able to lead and deliver and guide and guard and protect. They have grown because of all the terrible things they've been through, because of the pain, because of the suffering, because of Boromir's betrayal and then later redemption, because of the battles that they've been in, because of the interaction with Gollum and Frodo losing his finger, and because of the stab wound. All of that stuff has now come together and made these four hobbits, the leaders that they become when they get back to the Shire and have to rebuild and regrow. I think about the parable that we often call the parable of the dishonest manager, and what Jesus says following that. This is in Luke chapter 16, verse 10. One who is faithful in a very little is also faithful in much, and one who is dishonest in a very little is also dishonest in much. If then you have not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, who will entrust you the true riches? And if you have not been faithful in that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? No servant can serve two masters, for either he'll hate the one and love the other, or he'll be devoted to one and despise the other. You can't serve God and money. Let me bring those two things together, because that seems like I've now gone off to something completely different. I know we have all kinds of debates and arguments about what is coming next and where is what's coming next going to be. And I don't have all the answers to all that. But this statement right here says that whatever's coming next is like me finally getting what is my own. And everything that I'm doing here, it's not even really real. It's not what's true, but it's preparing me for something else. It's preparing me for the true riches. It is preparing me for something that is my own. Ultimately, I honestly don't know what that literally means, other than something is coming and I need to be prepared for it. And all of this stuff that we go through, the pain, the suffering, the battle, the conflict, the competition between these other gods that would try to turn us away from the one true living God, all of that is preparing me and you and everyone who's watching and listening today for something else that is going to be really real and really true. And in the context of Lord of the Rings, it's really kind of shocking, because there's this big, huge, epic battle and adventure. And then it's actually all about what happens at the end, where going through the big, epic battle and adventure actually prepares them for dealing with the stuff in their own home and what's true and what's real. It's kind of a shocking thing. And most people miss it because that ending seems anticlimactic, but it's really not. It's really powerful about what all of this did for those four hobbits.
Mm-hmm. My favorite line in Loconte's book, he has a phrase that he says, the mysterious intersection of providence and free will. That's what this whole thing is about, and the choices that we're making and what God's trying to bring out in us. We keep coming back to this idea of free will. When we make a good choice, when we choose to go in his direction, God is all in for us. He is beginning, of course, with sending Jesus in the first place, and him empowering us to find this success, to turn these lessons, like Edwin was saying, these lessons into helping us make sense of our world, helping us be lights in our community and salt in the earth. He will give us that. Now, that may or may not accomplish our own selfish short-term purposes in this life, but that's not supposed to be what this is all about anyway. Him empowering us to have the ability to go where we want to go, and giving us strength to complete that journey. It shows us what kind of people we are, and the pain and the suffering and all of that. That's part of it. That it can't not be part of it, because, like, and Josh was saying this too, the lessons that we learn in hardship, the lessons that we learn in adversity, are much more powerful and much more practical and much more long lasting than the lessons that we learn in prosperity. Usually the lessons that we learn in prosperity is, look how wonderful I am, look how clever I am, look how deserving I am, things like that don't really accomplish his purposes.
That would seem to be true, but if I can also plug in Ecclesiastes, if it really is written by Solomon, as I tend to think it is, that actually hit him in the times of prosperity. When I have all the money in the world and I have all the servants in the world and I have everything that I want, where I usually end up? I usually end up in despair anyway. So it's not like in this world where sin is now controlling, it's not like when everything is wonderful, I end up in a better place. It's like no matter what we tend towards is despair, because it's not good enough or it's too bad.
I think, I think sometimes we we need bad things to happen to us to wake us up. There can be, good can come from bad. I firmly believe that, right? We can see great good come from bad. We think about the life of David and this man after God's own heart, but he screwed up royally, right? With this sin with Bathsheba and the murder of, her husband and all these horrible things that were happening. And then when that child was struck, right, by God and the child died, David had a choice to make. He could have responded by lashing out at God and by losing his faith and having a hard heart. But I think that whole sort of episode is what it took to wake him up and open his eyes to what he had done, to the sin that he had done and the consequences for sin. And then David chooses to get up off the ground, to stop his mourning and to accept, okay, I'm not going to see this child again in this life, but I may be able to go to him. And if I repent and if I come back to God and I allow this to make me stronger and I respond positively with the right heart, then, he will not return to me, David says, but I will go to him. And maybe, and so I think it's all about how we respond. You think about, you think about Hitler, going back to Hitler and the Holocaust and the 6 million Jews that were exterminated and, all that horrible atrocities that we've seen in the 20th century. I think there was 60 million deaths in World War II compared to the 20 in World War I. And of course, Tolkien's son Christopher participated in World War II, and he was very concerned about his son during that war and all the things, the terror bombing of London that was going on. And Tolkien experienced some of the atrocities of World War II himself. But maybe in some ways, all those things had a good effect. And Joseph Loconte talks about in his book, the modernism that sort of was going on at this time, World War I, the rise of science, the rise of this atheism, the idea that evolution, right, and how these things are starting to build momentum. And then the eugenics campaign, the American eugenics campaign of the 1920s, where they're forcing sterilization on homeless populations and this idea of racial hierarchy and weeding out certain groups of people. That was seen as very scientific, right? To this modernist atheist sort of mindset of the time. That's survival of the fittest, right? The weak are supposed to be weeded out, and the quote unquote superior are supposed to be propagated and dominate the earth. And Hitler learned a lot of his philosophy from the United States. I mean, a lot of us are not aware of that. And it's very shocking when you study history. He studied states like California and Indiana that had abortion and sterilization policies and eugenics campaigns. And a lot of what he's doing in the Holocaust was modeled after that same. So this was a worldwide thing, not just a German thing, right? The Holocaust was not like an original to Germany. Eugenics, this idea, this atheistic survival of the fittest, eugenics kind of mindset was dominating the world through the 20s and 30s. And then when we get to the Holocaust with Hitler, and we see the culmination of this atheistic philosophy driven purely by man's understanding of science. And I think the world was shocked to its core when it came out what Hitler had done in the death camps, what the end game is to this philosophy. It literally shook the world to its core. And all of a sudden, eugenics kind of stopped in its tracks for several decades. I mean, it's coming back now. You look at things that are going on with CRISPR technology and the Human Genome Project. We're seeing somewhat of a return to some of these ideas. But when the world saw the end result of this philosophy, maybe that's in some ways how good came from that bad. Maybe that's what it took to wake the world up. And you get into the 1950s. A lot of people say that's like the golden age of American history, a return to conservatism, right? Conservative values, conservative thought. Not that the 50s were perfect, but we do see sort of return to more traditional conservative, thinking about values and morals and doing the right thing. And so again, we need to make sure we look at the big picture and not be so quick to assume that bad things are always bad and there's nothing good that can come from bad,
Right.
and that God must be unjust because he allowed something bad to happen. He has to allow that in order for free will to exist.
Well, it's kind of interesting that you use the phrase weeding out, and I don't want to compare God to Hitler at all here, but there isn't that what hardship in this life is in large measure. God is testing our faith. God is seeing what we're made of, and we show ourselves to be a certain kind of character in hardship. I keep coming back to Job 1, I think it's verse 8, verse 10. I hear this in my sleep sometimes. Does Job serve God for nothing? Why are you here? Are you serving God because everything is great, because God has given you all this great stuff, or even because of your hope of heaven, as far as that goes? Why are you here? Are you ultimately serving God simply because he is God, because he deserves your worship, because he created you, he made you in his image, and therefore necessarily you must be his servant? That's the kind of person that he's looking for. And he finds that person in adversity. He finds them in hardship and difficulty, the refining fire. That it's not the bad people who go through the refining fire. It's all of us, and especially the good people sometimes, to find out, are we really at our core God's kind of people? Are we people of faith ultimately? We find out in the hard times.
I think one of the struggles we're dealing with is that we live in the first world country that we all live in. And we live, I mean, guys, let's just face it. We live in the, maybe not the absolute top echelon of even in this first world country, but we live in those top layers. And so any pain causes us problems. I do recognize the return seemingly to some good, strong conservative values in the 50s. But, there's a whole group of people that would say, no, those weren't golden years. Those were terrible, awful years, because even the people who returned to their conservative values didn't quite return to biblical values. And it's, so it's this struggle. And the reason I bring all that up is because I think part of the problem is we live in this kind of protected world that has led us to believe that, being a faithful Christian means everything gets protected and there isn't pain. Whereas really, historically, most of the population of the world for most of its history went to bed at night, never knowing if they were going to wake up the next morning. And so we really struggle with some of these concepts because our idea of how the world works is so different than the way it has worked historically since Adam and Eve were cast out of the garden, and the trauma. And because our world has actually been so good, it's hard for us to look forward to something that we think is actually going to be better. Right. And those who have historically lived in the way the world really works, the message of what's coming, rather than storing up treasures in the last days, being able to store up treasures in the kingdom of heaven had a much stronger appeal, because these last days weren't that great. Our problem is they've been pretty good. I mean, my days have been pretty good. I've always lived in a house. I've always had food. I've always been able to do anything that I wanted. I get to see beautiful places and enjoy those things. And it's hard for me to imagine anything coming later being better than this. And so I want to grab hold of it and preserve it. And if anything challenges that, I think, it's just all gone awry, instead of realizing this is the sinful world we live in. One other thing that I wanted to bring up, because I want to tie this together, and that is, we were talking earlier about the idea of being automatons and robots. I hope that folks actually recognize that if there is no God, we are all automatons. None of us are making any choices. All we have is matter and energy. That law that we learned in high school physics: for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. If there is no spiritual, if there is no mind, if there is no spirit, soul, heart, if there is no God, then all we are the falling dominoes of the equal and opposite reactions to everything that's happened. I may think that I'm thinking, but I'm not. All this stuff going on in my head is actually just things firing back and forth. It's an illusion. It's an illusion. If there is no God, we are just all automatons. There is no free will. It's all just a deception that we're making choices. And it's a happy deception that we all that we can't help but buy into, because of course that's the reaction that's equal and opposite to the previous reaction. It's only when God is in the world that there's even the potential of free will. And I know among those who believe in God, there's arguments about free will, but I know this: if there is no God, there's no option at all for free will.
That's right.
I think Darwin would say, yeah, that if we're just highly evolved animals, then we are purely products of instincts, right? And our DNA, our biology dominates everything, just like in the animal kingdom. And we have we have this perception of free will, but it doesn't actually exist. But I think, maybe when we see things like World War I and World War II and all the horrible sort of things that came out of that, maybe that's evidence of free will, right? We saw people courageously standing up to evil and being willing to risk their lives. That's very much an anti-scientific thing, you could argue, right? The idea of that fight or flight instinct. Animals that have no free will, self-preservation is the number one instinct, right? And when they perceive threat, they're going to take care of themselves. Animals are hardwired to take care of themselves first and foremost. And yet we see it sometimes in the worst of times, people, moving beyond that, beyond those basic instincts of selfishness and thinking about the greater good. And, we refer to the World War II generation as like the greatest generation, and not that they were perfect, but I think they were refined by the fire, right? A lot of that generation lived through, a lot of them, World War I, the Great Depression. They lived, these are our grandparents, right? Or our great grandparents that lived through those things. And they look at our generation, the more modern sort of generation, as being so affluent and being, maybe sometimes, that can be a disadvantage for us. It's harder for a rich man to go into the kingdom of heaven, or harder to go through the eye of a needle, easier to go through the eye of a needle than to get into the kingdom of heaven. So the more affluent, the more wealthy we are, the less we go through trials and tribulations and bad times. Maybe the more we tend to lose our character, we tend to lose those traits and those virtues that are the most important. And so maybe we should actually, desire trials and tribulations. We should desire, and this is kind of a tough thing to say. We don't want to wish, horrible things upon ourselves or necessarily pray for those things, but seeing the silver lining, the good things that can come from it, going through that fire and being refined. I mean, we need to just think about that big picture when we're trying to, sort of wrap our minds around these things and decide how to respond to it as Christians.
And so we are to perhaps count it all joy when we meet trials of various kinds, and knowing that steadfastness will have its perfect work, making us perfect and complete, lacking in nothing.
Can I quote you on that, Edwin?
No, you can't quote me on that.
You've been listening to the Citizen of Heaven podcast. Thank you for your support. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe through your favorite podcast platform and or on YouTube. Comments, corrections, and suggestions are always welcome. Please feel free to follow me through Facebook, MeWe, Parler, or Instagram, or check out my webpage, www.halhammonds.com. Until next time, be strong and courageous, fight the good fight of faith, and do all things in the name of the Lord Jesus. This is Hal Hammonds, the Citizen of Heaven, signing off.